All right. Hi, all. Welcome to the Iran 1400 Project Spotlighting an Author event. Today, we will be discussing Dr. Robert Asaadi's Postrevolutionary Iran, the Leader, the People, and the Three Powers. Thank you all for joining us today. If you don't already know, the goal of the Iran 1400 Project is to encourage productive conversation about Iran by looking at the evolution of ideas and institutions within the country during the last century. We are certain that today's discussion will be a valuable contribution to that mission. Before we introduce our guest, I will share some quick remarks on behalf of our advisory board. Dr. Asaadi, on behalf of the advisory board and the team at Iran 1400 Project, we thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule to be with us today. The Iran 1400 Project's mission is to foster a greater understanding of Iran's history during the past century and promote an informed conversation about Iran's future. We are honored to have you with us today to share your research and your insights on the Iranian experience. Welcome. And now I will present our guest. Dr. Robert Asaadi is an instructor in the departments of Political Science and International Studies at Portland State University. He holds a PhD from the Department of Political Science from the University of Minnesota and works in the subfields of international relations and comparative politics. His research and teaching interests include international relations theory, international security, Middle East and Iranian politics, and U.S. foreign policy. For today's event, we will hear Dr. Asaadi discuss his book for around 30 minutes, and then after that, we will have around 30 minutes for a Q&A session. Y'all are welcome to send those questions into the Q&A section on Zoom at any time during the event. Additionally, you can email those to media@iran1400.org. And before we begin, we have a quick teaser. Dr. Asaadi, the floor is yours.
Great. Thank you so much, Sydney, for that very kind introduction. One quick correction regarding my institutional affiliation. So I'm no longer with Portland State University, and I'm now an instructor of political science, a tenure track instructor at Portland Community College. So just one minor change to be very clear. But thank you so much. I'm really glad to be speaking with the group today. Thank you, those of you who are in attendance. I appreciate your time this afternoon or morning for me, based in Portland, Oregon. We're still in the late morning. I spent some time looking at the Iran 1400 YouTube channel, and I'm very honored to be here with the group. It was reminding me of my bibliography for my dissertation, seeing a lot of the same names of scholars whose work I've followed for many years now. So I'm very glad to be here with you. So I want to just improvise a little bit from speaking strictly about my book to actually share with you some more recent research that I'm doing and talk with you about how my own thinking about trying to understand institutional and ideational evolution in Iran, as Sydney put it, the mission of this project, as I understand it. I've been moving more in the direction of focusing on the question of political attitudes at the mass level in Iran. But the book, which was written basically over a 2-year period in 2019 and 2020, is focused much more on trying to understand the governing institutions of the system of the Islamic Republic of Iran on the occasion of the 40th anniversary of the inauguration of this system. So thinking about what can we gain by revisiting Iran's constitution. And I should say, much in the same way as I'm a political scientist by training. So political scientists tend to be interested in constitutional frameworks. And we think, maybe somewhat naively, that these actually matter for how political systems evolve over time. So I wanted to take the occasion of the 40th anniversary of the revolution to look back and say, what can we understand about this generative moment in Iran's history, and what possibilities for thinking about Iran's governing institutions otherwise might we gain from revisiting the constitution itself. And then so the book is interested in these kind of foundational questions. What were the debates even among different strands of Islamists or Islamic theologians at the time, thinking about, well, how can we reconcile principles of vilayat faqih with democratic institutions, which, as you all well know, go back to the early 20th century in Iran's history. So that's one part of what the book inquires into. The second piece is setting aside these constitutional questions. What can we say about how these institutions have evolved practically over the first 4 decades of the Islamic Republic system? So my inquiry into the book was really inspired by a type of argument that I came up against again and again, reading, for example, foreign policy literature about Iran. Even it's kind of summarized in a foreign affairs article that came out in 2020 by Eric Edelman and Ray Takei, which was titled "The Next Iranian Revolution," subtitle "Why Washington Should Seek Regime Change in Tehran." And basically, the authors of that piece set out an argument that's premised on some assumptions that I thought merited further inquiry, like assumptions that Iran's political system it can never move beyond being a revolutionary kind of political movement, that the supreme leader, this position of the supreme leader, singularly dominates everything in Iran's politics. Elections have not and cannot have lead to meaningful political change. Reformist efforts the system cannot be reformed, basically, and that political socialization through certain state-sponsored institutions like the media and the education system have basically shaped Iranian public opinion in favor of the regime. And so all of those assumptions, I thought, well, they needed further explanation, or they needed further inquiry. And so really that's what the book tries to look into. In the first half of the book, I focus on basically the 3 branches of government. What can we say about executive power? Iran has a very unique system of sharing executive power. Initially, it was shared between the office of the supreme leader, the president, and a prime minister. Through constitutional reforms, the position of prime minister was abolished. So what can we say about that? Secondly, what's the role of the Majlis? What about legislative power? Third, what about the courts and the mediating councils of the Guardian Council and Expediency Council? So that's really the first half of the book. And I approach it, as a political scientist. So when I teach US government, we talk about the 3 branches of government. When I teach comparative politics, we look at systems around the world and compare the relationship between three branches of government. And so I wanted to try to look in a very kind of clear way at what does the Constitution say and what does the historical record tell us about power sharing among these three branches, and is what we have seen for the last now 44 years, is that all that is possible within this system, or can this system actually reform? The second half of the book shifts gears and focuses a lot more on public attitudes, the media, the role of social movements. I talk about three types of social movements. The first is a movement for environmental reform, environmental justice. The second is movements for economic justice. So I look closely at the protests in recent years, late 2017, 2018, the so-called day protests in response to rising food prices. And later in 2019, 2020, the Asaadi protests in response to rising fuel prices. And obviously now we know the story of recent months, the Woman Life Freedom movement and the protests that were widespread in the fall of last year. So that actually is the third category of movements I talk about in the book, and that is movements for women's rights, which have been ongoing since the inauguration of the Islamic Republic itself, and certainly even predating it in under the time of the Shah as well. So what I want to kind of shift gears and talk with you about here and share some information with you, and I'll just share my screen, is kind of my thinking about this question of how attitudes are changing in Iran and what's the significance of this moving forward. So I'm happy to talk with you about my book during the Q&A if you have questions. The book is written, and I'd be in a way kind of more interested in hearing your thoughts on this ongoing work that I recently presented at the Doha Institute for Graduate Studies in Qatar. And that is, what can we say about political culture in Iran? How is it changing in response to these moments of crisis that we've seen in recent years that I just mentioned? For example, widespread protests, most recently around questions initially about women's rights and gender equality, but that have moved on beyond that to broader issues of personal freedom, civil liberties, and the question of democracy and the accountability of the state to society. So I want to share with you some data, some general questions that I'm interested in my research is, what is the impact of crisis on political culture? So when we talk about the evolution of ideas, we tend to talk about it in terms of large processes and structural changes associated with modernization theory, for example, or secularization, or late stage capitalism. Globalization is another, all of these big processes that shift cultures. And I think that's absolutely valid and true, but it seems to me that there's also a role, or we also need to be attentive to how particular moments of crisis, which may spark around events which in and of themselves are kind of seemingly insignificant at the national level, let's say. For example, a woman dying or being killed in police custody is a terrible, tragic thing. But the exact connection of such an instance to widespread national protests, that in itself, I think, is something we need to understand. These moments of crisis somehow give us insight into changes that are difficult to observe kind of in their absence. So I'm curious about this. When does a given crisis become an inflection point rather than a passing moment of uncertainty? And I've tried in my research now, or I'm interested in a framework that political scientists have used to understand state-society relations. It goes back to the work of a scholar named Albert Hirschman. He wrote a book called Exit, Voice, and Loyalty, Responses to Decline. I think it's called in firms or in societies. So initially he's looking at economic conditions, but this framework of what does society choose? What do individuals in society choose in response to the conditions of life that they experience? Do they choose to exit their society, maybe immigrate, or just disengage from politics? Do they choose to remain loyal to a regime that may be, not so democratic? Maybe they get some benefit, so they have a public sector job, let's say, or they're part of a patron-client network. Or do they choose to express voice? And that voice could be voting in an election, or it could be participating in a demonstration or a protest. So this is generally some of the things I'm interested in. My analytical framework is I have a kind of taxonomy or some patterns of thinking about society's level of public confidence in government, or another way to say is society's perception of the legitimacy of government. We might think of that in kind of relative terms. So I'm not giving you any kind of magic numbers here to say, well, what is a high level of public confidence? What is a low level of public confidence? The point really is, what's the dynamic? Meaning, like, how is this changing over time? Is public confidence starting out at a relatively high level and remaining relatively high, what we might call a stable, responsive relationship between state and society, in which most or many people in society would choose to express loyalty in the government, right? This is kind of like the domain of stable, consolidated democracy. And you can see the other categories. Confidence could be low and remain low. Confidence could be low and become high. This is kind of the story of improvement in governance. Maybe decline of corruption, increase in democratization, and so on. Or the case that I argue Iranian society appears to be manifesting, and that is a shift from relatively high, or higher, maybe is a better way to put it, patterns of public confidence to lower public confidence in government. And so this is what we would be thinking about when we think about a state in a kind of legitimacy crisis. And under these conditions, I argue larger and larger swaths of society may opt for protest, expressing voice, expressing discontent, rather than just disengaging from politics or remaining loyal. So this is kind of the framework that I'm considering in my ongoing research on this topic. I'll spare you the literature review. All of this is to say there's a long tradition of studying this idea of legitimacy crisis, and that we can somehow try to measure political culture through things like opinion polls or observation of protest movements. So I'm happy to revisit this if you're interested in the Q&A, but this is some of the academic literature that I draw on, basically in saying we can use opinion polls to try to get a sense of how political culture may be changing in any given society. So in a way, the theoretical diagram that I'm working with, and this was born in part out of the work I did in the book, and kind of how my thinking has changed since the book was published, is let's begin with the position of the average citizen. The average citizen in a society has a number of choices for how they engage in politics. They can disengage through exit, they can express their views, they can express grievances and discontent, or they can remain loyal. The catch then is we have to think about, how does the state respond? So how does the state respond to widespread protests, let's say? States can respond in a number of ways. In political science, we use this alliterative phrase that states can choose reform, they can choose rewarding loyalty, rewarding supporters, or they can choose repression. I would add a fourth R, that states can choose reframing, which is trying to convince society that what they're seeing is actually, caused by something other than or whatever the dominant framing might be. So states engage in kind of frame contestation with societies. In the Iranian case, a lot of that in recent years has been to blame protests on foreign subterfuge and meddling in some way. So that's one example of frame contestation that the regime has undertaken. The interesting thing here, and what I try to restore in my work, is that this is a process. Actors in societies have some preferences. They encounter a certain situation. Based on that, they make a calculation to act in a particular way in relation to the government. The government, or the state, let's say, responds. And then there's another phase. Society responds in response to that. And so this, I argue, is something important that we should be thinking about now that the Iranian state has made very clear that it's willing to use the coercive apparatus of violence of the state against protesters, and now several hundred in the current wave of protests, several hundred people, according to human rights groups who monitor this, have been killed, many jailed, some executed, others facing the threat of execution, and so on. So repression has been used. Now, how will actors in society respond? Many have fled the country, many have emigrated. That's been going on for some time now. It's a big problem for Iran's economy, to say nothing of the human effect. This phenomenon of brain drain is something that's been written about since the early 1980s in the Iranian context. Others can still choose loyalty, but I argue that there's a kind of funneling that those who have disengaged or fled have done so. Those who have doubled down and remain loyal to the regime have done so. And increasingly, I think, it seems to me, looking at the record of the last 5.5 years, is that the amount of people in Iranian society who have no option left other than to express voice, to express their discontent or their decline in public confidence in the regime, is growing, or has been growing. So understanding I only have about 10 minutes left, I want to share some data with you. So one of the big problems we have in political science and trying to study attitudes in Iran is there's not a huge amount of comparable, consistent, reliable data. And that's a big problem because it allows basically a lot of analysts to kind of apply what may be their own preferences and say, here's where Iranian society is moving, or here's what Iranian society thinks about topic X. And that usually relies on kind of anecdotal observations, maybe some ethnographic research, and all of that has its place, and those are valid methods. But I think it would be valuable also if we had more consistent comparative polling data from Iranians themselves living inside of Iran. So there is some of this available. There's a organization called World Values Survey, which has been conducting opinion polls in countries around the world since the early 1980s. And periodically, it has included Iran in its measures 3 times, 3 out of the 7 waves that World Values Survey has conducted. There's also a couple other groups, one called Iran Poll, which is based out of Toronto, Canada, and they conduct computer-assisted telephone interviewing with Iranians living inside Iran about a whole range of topics. And the third one I use in my research is called the Group for Analyzing and Measuring Attitudes in Iran. They're based out of Tilburg University in the Netherlands, and they use polling through social media apps among Iranians, mostly inside Iran, and also some Iranians in the diaspora. So I want to share with you what I think are some really interesting findings, basically to support the argument I just presented that Iranian society in the last 7 or 8 years has seen a quite precipitous decline in its public confidence in government. So, Part of the story here is a demographic question. As I'm sure many of you well know, that this is something scholars working on Iran have been talking about for a long time. Iran experienced a population boom in the mid and late 90s in response to pro-natalist policies passed by the government. And so there was a lot of discussion of what's going to happen when this generation reaches political maturity. What will they demand of the system, under which they grew up, and they don't have the historical referent of what life was like before the Islamic Revolution. So kind of the argument that, well, maybe things aren't perfect now, but it's not as bad as it was in terms of, whatever outcome you want to focus on, maybe inequality, let's say. It's not as bad as it was under the Shah. So that argument maybe doesn't resonate so much to someone who was born in 1985 rather than someone who was born in 1955. What's been so interesting looking at the recent wave of the Woman Life Freedom protests is it was not the generation born in the 1980s that has been at the forefront, but instead the generation born in the 1380s, right? The so-called 80s kids or young people. So people basically born from 2002 forward. This has been initially was the most active group participating in these protests. So that I think is an interesting phenomenon. A little bit more about the economic conditions. I'll move through this very quickly. So we can look at a whole range of data. This comes from the Iran 2040 project at Stanford University. So we could look at something like inflation and see in recent years, the Iranian economy has had inflation levels north of 30%, extremely high. What about daily minimum wage? Daily minimum wage fixed to a 2020 US dollar constant, you can see has been moving down really since the middle of the Rouhani administration. We should remember it was in 2018 that the US unilaterally withdrew from the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, and Iran's economy has been in a free fall basically since then. Real daily minimum wages, we could compare Iran to Turkey, China, South Korea, and see the trend over time, quite anemic levels of real minimum daily wages, which is a measure economists like to use to see how the average person is actually experiencing kind of their engagement with the economy in terms of what they're earning. This was an interesting figure, real GDP growth, taken the average percent per year over the 40-year period from 1980 to 2020. How does Iran compare to some other developing economies? You can see less than 2% average yearly GDP growth, quite low compared to others. The UAE, Turkey, China, you can see is around 9% average growth in that period. A last one in terms of economic measures, what about home ownership rates? You can see have been declining in both urban and rural areas. So the question is then, an individual confronting this deteriorating economic condition, how does this translate to their attitudes toward government? And so I want to share with you some tables here summarizing this. So this is from Iran poll that I mentioned, the telephone interviewing of Iranians inside Iran, nationally representative, statistically significant samples. And just look at the very bad category here. So they ask, in your opinion, how good or bad is our country's general economic situation? From 2015 to the most recent one, July of 2022, you can see what this looks like. So the very bad assessment has more than doubled. What about another measure? Right now, do you think economic conditions in Iran as a whole are getting better or getting worse? So what's your vision for the future? Again, 2015 to 2022, how many people think it's getting worse? From 37% to 65%. They asked some specific measures about the Raisi government. So do you have confidence? What's your level of confidence that the Raisi government can significantly lower inflation? Only 2 data points here because the government is still, relatively new, coming into office just in 2021. But you can see already the initial assessment. Are you very confident? It nearly halves. Not at all confident, more than doubles. What about lowering unemployment? Similar trend. Not at all confident or not very confident increases, and the positive confidence measures decrease. Do you think the government can root out corruption? He came in with some fairly high levels of confidence, combining the variance somewhat. About nearly 3 in 4 Iranians in the survey in September 2021 said they did think that the Raisi government could root out corruption. That has deteriorated. So you see the number from July of last year. Switching now to Gaman, the one from the Netherlands, they had a great survey from February of last year, now it's almost a year ago, where they asked this question: do you approve of the way Ebrahim Raisi is handling his job as president? And you can see, just look at the totals, 68.9% disapproval already in February 2022. I'll move through some of these. So they ask interesting questions about democracy, maybe more in the Q&A. I can say more about that. Just in the interest of time, seeing I only have a minute left, I'll just skip forward. Sometimes I get a question about the Gaman data in that it's using social media apps to come up with its findings. And is that really reliable, basically, is the question. Well, what's so interesting about that survey instrument is they anticipated that question. And so they said, let's also use compare it to survey findings from World Values Survey, which is an in-person, face-to-face survey conducted in Iran, most recently in 2020. And they asked they asked again some World Values Survey questions. World Values Survey has these questions that ask you, like, how important is your life? How important in life for you is your family? How important in your life is your friends, your work, and so on? And so if the Gaman instrument is reliable, it stands to reason that it should be pretty similar, right? People who say their family is important in their life. It should be similar when compared to the face-to-face World Values Survey. And what was interesting about that is they did find quite high levels of similarity when they asked respondents about the importance of family in their life. When they asked about importance of friends, you can see the very important there, basically the same. Importance of work. So that all gave them confidence in the reliability of this instrument. What's interesting, though, is when we asked, when there's questions asked about religion, when that's face-to-face, respondents, 69.4% said religion was very important in their life. But when they were asked on social media, that number declined by less than half, 30.8%. And so in the Gaman report, they actually say this shows us that using social media app, maybe as a polling tool, maybe it's actually more accurate. And maybe there's a kind of preference falsification that when people were asked face-to-face, they somehow felt that they had to say religion was more important in their life maybe than it actually was. So this, I just think it's an interesting finding, and it's the only one that really is significantly different than the other confidence measures. So I see I'm just at 30 minutes. Let me just jump to the very end to kind of say, what do I think is important going forward for this? So what we really need is more consistent quantitative survey data to supplement kind of our accounts of social movements and protests in Iran. So we need to have more reliable and more comparable data. There's a number of public opinion polling barometers that are used in the Middle East. One is called the Arab Barometer, another called the Arab Opinion Index, which is based out of the Doha Institute for Graduate Studies in Qatar, where I just recently was for an academic conference. The problem is, because these are focused on the Arab world, they exclude Iran. So we don't have the same kind of, we can't say with certainty that, Iranians, are they being asked the same questions as Saudis and Egyptians and Jordanians and so on. So what I would recommend for us to think about is to either include Iran in these measures, or maybe we need to develop our own barometer for Iran that can have more consistency than World Values Survey or some of these other survey tools I've mentioned that are maybe more focused on specific issues, or they're not taking place every single year. So we can't, right now, we don't have as clear of a picture on how political culture and attitudes are changing in Iran year to year. Instead, we have kind of more fragmented data. So that would be kind of my pitch for the future, is we need better sources of data to really understand attitudinal change at the countrywide level. So thanks so much for your attention, and I'll definitely look forward to questions or comments that you might have.
Thank you so much, Dr. Asaadi, for that incredibly interesting presentation. Truly, polling is incredibly fascinating. So thanks for bringing that to our attention. And before we get into questions, well, first I should say, if y'all have any questions, remember that you can either send those into the Zoom Q&A, or you can send those questions to media@iran1400.org. Before we get into the questions, I'll announce a few quick announcements that we have coming up with the project. Next month, spotlighting an author will be with Leora Hendelman Bavour, where she will discuss her book, Creating the Modern Iranian Woman, Popular Culture Between Two Revolutions. If you're subscribed to our email list, you'll get a notification about when and where through Zoom. And then also be on the lookout for an upcoming article that we have by myself, actually, called The Evolution of Local Government in Iran. That's actually based off of a spotlighting an author event that we had with Dr. Kian Tajbakhsh. He had a really fascinating Q&A response, and it was so fascinating that I decided to turn it into a blog. So hopefully today we can create more of those conversations. Once again, please do send those questions into the Zoom Q&A. While we wait for those to come in, I can start with one of my own. Dr. Asaadi, I wrote an article in late 2020 called "Do Iranians Really Care Who Wins the US Election?" And I also am particularly fascinated with polls because I used a lot of polling in my article, but I did go look at polling from the Iranian Students Polling Association. And so I wanted to ask about reliability of Iranian polls, with obviously taken with a grain of salt. What I was looking at was their polling on, does essentially the question, will the presidential election in the United States have an effect on Iran? And 52% of Iranians in the 2016 election said it makes no difference whether Donald Trump or Hillary Clinton wins for Iran. Is polling like that reliable if it doesn't have anything to do with negative sentiment towards the Iranian government itself?
Yeah, thanks for that question. You know, it's so interesting. I mentioned I was just participating in this research conference in Doha, and I presented the work that I'm doing now using some of these polls, and the faculty discussant was a scholar named Mehran Kamrava, who I suspect many of your audience and would be familiar with his work. I believe he was at Georgetown before, and he's written a lot about the Gulf Arab states, and actually I think he just has a new book came out this year on Iran. Mm-hmm. Something like the Islamic Republic in Search of an Identity, something like this. And he was, I got into a discussion with him about Iranian Students Polling Agency, just like you mentioned. And, his take was that is a completely unreliable source. Some findings that I've seen of theirs, it's interesting, showed a quite high level of congruity on certain questions about support for democracy, let's say, than I've seen in World Values Survey or other measures. So that was interesting to me because, in theory, right, we would expect that to be a hard case to say, well, okay, if it's completely controlled by the state, we would expect to see very low levels in their findings of like, do Iranians support democracy? But that wasn't the case. So I'm not sure exactly how to answer that question, because I'm not privy to all of the details of their methodology, but I would just share that this, senior scholar, Dr. Kamrava, his opinion was that that is not something that should be taken, as a 100% reliable source. There is polling data. There are academics inside Iran conducting polls. The problem is a lot of the findings are not publicly accessible. We just get these kind of like quite brief summary reports. And so I have my own reservations about reproducing that without really being able to see what's the methodology. So, I mean, I would hope maybe there's a good space here for collaboration between academics, maybe inside and outside of Iran to do this. But in the meantime, like what's a good workaround? There are these groups which are led by Iranian academics, living outside of Iran, that are conducting polling of people inside of Iran using either telephone or social media polling methods, which I think have a lot to say in terms of their reliability. So that in the meantime could be a good workaround, because we have this bigger dilemma. This is something that's always been so interesting to me about political science and polling is, how do we predict political change in what we might call authoritarian contexts, which I think, I think we can describe Iran as one of these. Practically no political scientists saw the decline of the Soviet Union coming, because there's this phenomenon of preference falsification that I mentioned, that people who maybe come to dislike their government in an authoritarian context are apt to conceal or hide their desire for change or their criticism of the regime, as long as political opposition seems weak. The economist Timur Kuran at Duke University has written about this as even in the late 1980s, and he was interested in the Iranian case. Why did no one see the Islamic Revolution coming until it was already well into motion? Well, he says because it's not until opposition began to see tens of thousands and hundreds of thousands of people actually on the street to say, oh, actually, maybe other people share my dissatisfaction, and they're expressing it. And it becomes a kind of tipping point where a slight surge in the opposition's apparent size and visibility, as I said, that could be caused by events which in and of themselves seem insignificant. This was part of the lesson of the Arab uprisings of 2011. It's another interesting case. So Quran says in this article, a revolution may appear unlikely in foresight, right, looking ahead, but in hindsight, it can appear inevitable because of the occurrence of these panoply of hidden conflicts. And so this is something I'm trying to figure out. How can we actually go about measuring this? So I'm thinking about the economic measures that tell us something, I think, very important about the material conditions of life in Iran for the average Iranian. And then we're starting to get a kind of slow trickle of data, opinion polling, to say, what's the relationship between material conditions and people's attitudes? And this is something that is measured in all countries all around the world. We have a good sense of the questions to ask to understand this. And so, my own opinion, I wouldn't completely throw out everything done by the ISPA, but maybe to think of it alongside other, all of these other types of resources that we have, and we should be doing a lot more. And I think Iran needs to be integrated in some of these regional opinion barometers, and that's something I'm hopeful about working on going forward, and very interested in collaborating with others who are also believing in the idea that if you ask people what they think about government, they'll give you a real answer that you can then measure.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. We do have a comment rather than a question. We have a comment in the Q&A from Norma Mahdavi. Years ago, an American educated Iran, an American-educated Iran who was president of Bank Melli, said, "The problem with polls or surveys in Iran is that we now think we know something." So that's interesting if you have any comment on that. If not, we can just go to the next question. Thanks for your lecture. It seems that you didn't mention the survey that University of Maryland has been conducting for a long time. Any specific reason to not mention its results?
No specific reason. I know the University of Maryland, what is it, Center for Strategic and International Studies or something like this. They also widely use Iran poll data. Yeah, there's always many sources we might use, and it was maybe on my part an error of omission, not an error of commission.
Got you. Thank you. So in terms of thinking about accurately understanding social engagement in Iran, you mentioned briefly, you talked briefly about social media. I'm curious if you could go into more detail about that. I'm curious about how accurately you think social media could be used to gauge public opinion, especially because oftentimes the people who are using social media the most happen to be, how do I put this? Those who are active on social media tend to be the loudest in general, of those who are voicing their concerns. So how accurate what ways could one use the activity of social media in Iran to gauge the population as a whole, if at all?
Yeah, thanks for that. I mean, it's such a great question. So part of what I think is valuable about using social media in Iran's case is, so for example, the source I cited here from the Netherlands, that the actual way it's happening is through a VPN, a siphon VPN, which is a secure process which allows the respondent to have a certain degree of anonymity. It's using Telegram, Instagram, WhatsApp, and Twitter. And we have some data about internet usage and social media usage in Iran. So, for example, the World Bank had a 2020 report where they estimated that 84% of Iran's population used the internet. So that's not everyone, for sure. That's 84%. Okay, so when we're talking about the representativeness of a sample that relies on social media, we should be aware of that. And actually, even the Iranian Students Polling Agency that we're talking about, in August of 2021, they produced a study which said that just over 70% of Iranians age over 18 used at least one social media platform. And so there is, it's not perfect. No polling, no sampling. You're trying to sample a population, so we always have to be sensitive to these questions of representativeness. So it's not perfect, but I think it has some value. We should be aware that it may be discounting groups, for example, in rural areas or from a lower socioeconomic status, for sure. But there are still demographic questions that can be asked, about these types of control variables, which allow you to say, like, am I actually getting a broad enough spectrum of respondents? So that's kind of one way you can ask questions about respondents' age group, education level, province, urban, rural region, and employment status, household income, and so on. That can help address some of these concerns. But yes, absolutely, these are still things to be aware of, and even to a lesser extent in a telephone poll, right? The problem is, maybe there's some just difference between someone who receives a phone call and agrees to take a survey and someone who hangs up. So I would say, yes, these are problems, but we don't need to reinvent the wheel here. these aren't problems that are unique to Iran, and we can refer to how polling agencies and pollsters who have been doing this for a long time in other contexts, make sense of these types of challenges. But as I said, for me, I'm someone who for a long time, I wrote my dissertation and wrote my book really focused on institutions. And so this is a new area for me. I'm not someone whose expertise is in polling. I'm kind of a new consumer to this in the last year or so. And so I have a lot to learn too about mitigating the uncertainty and the noise in the data because of sampling from exactly the type of thing you're asking. So it's a great question, and it's one that, I still need to wrestle with more.
Fantastic. Thank you. A reminder to those in the audience that y'all can send those questions in through the Zoom Q&A. We do have time for a couple more questions. In order to shift to your book, Dr. Asaadi, I wanted to shift to your book and connect it to the protests going on right now. So a common theme that a lot of, especially the Western media, is reporting on is reform or revolution in the Islamic Republic. So given that your book really details these institutions and the branches and governance, how easy is reform in the Islamic Republic? And I know that that sounds very broad, but with the structures of power in Iran, is it fair to assume that reform is harder than it sounds in general?
Great question. I mean, this relationship between reform and revolution, I think it's one of the enduring challenges that all political, systems face in their reproduction over time. I don't really know where to kind of sink into this. One thing I can say is, so the most recent kind of critical juncture that I think we saw in Iranian society relationship to the state prior to the last 4 or 5 years was the green movement around the disputed 2009 June presidential election. And I think we can gain a lot by listening to the political slogans that we see around these movements. I mean, there's a lot of scholars have written quite eloquently about the political lexicon in Iran and how it functioned in the Islamic Revolution period and how it's evolved over time. And there was a slogan in the Green Movement protests that maybe speaks to this point. One of the slogans was "Natarsid, Natarsid mal baham hastim." Don't be afraid, don't be afraid, we're all here together. And so it was society speaking to itself. Basically, protesters were trying to reassure one another, don't be afraid of the state repressing, us, that we're here together. In the most recent wave of protests going back to the day protests, that phrase, maybe some people in the audience know about this already, but that phrase so eloquently, because of the structure of the Persian language, was changed from saying, don't be afraid, to saying, be afraid, betarsid, the imperative form. Now society was directing its injunction not to itself to calm itself and reassure its own fears, but directing its command toward the state to saying, we're here now and we demand that you reform and you should be afraid of us here in the street. And that's something I think about in terms of this appeal of reform and revolution. I mean, I don't think, certainly I could not have predicted, and I don't know how many people could, of what we've seen in the last few months in the country in terms of acts of, expressions of opposition to not only to the government, but to the entire system itself. It's been quite incredible. The future of this, or the the success of this movement in trying to achieve its aims, I think, remains an unresolved question. But certainly, I think something has changed. Something has changed here where it's become clear that especially the younger generation, folks 30 and under, let's say, are demanding something quite fundamental here. And, we could look at, well, what is the regime? What can we say about the regime as it is now? The current supreme leader is now in his early 80s and by many accounts in, conditions of failing health. And so it opens up this question of succession, which I know previous speakers in this group have talked about. There has only been one such transfer of power in this very young system of the Islamic Republic between Ayatollah Khomeini and Ayatollah Khamenei. So, in a way, I think of it like, could we say everything that we could describe every aspect of the American presidency, for example, if we only had the examples of George Washington and John Adams? So for sure, we couldn't have predicted what the institution of the presidency looks like today, let alone Theodore Roosevelt and so on. So I always try to remind my students when we talk about Iran that the system of the Islamic Republic is very new against a framework of 2,500 years of monarchy in Iran. And if we look to just the letter of the Constitution, the system could be quite a bit more fluid in terms of empowering an elected president and having a supreme leader take on more of a role as a steward of the religious institutions alone and being less active in policy, less active in controlling the military and so on. There's nothing in theory that precludes this. Instead, this is the way in which the first two occupants of that office have exercised their authority within it. And when we study post-revolutionary societies in any context, think about the Soviet Union, China, Cuba, even France, going back to the French Revolution, something starts to happen when there's a generational shift among the leadership. So in the 1980s in China, we get the emergence of Deng Xiaoping and a reform movement in China. Did it undo everything upholding the system of communist governance in China? No, but it set the course on a different path. Or we could look to the example of Khrushchev in the Soviet Union. What was one of the first things he did when he came to power? He denounced the excesses of Stalinism. So something is happening here where if there is a change in leadership, whether at the presidential level or at this level of supreme leader, there has to be, I feel, a reckoning with the fact that not everything that's happened in the last 4 decades has been positively received by Iranian society. And so reform, I think, in a way, there's something inevitable about it in terms of the regime's survival. I think there is an awareness of that, that there has to be some change to meet Iranian society more where it is, rather than compel it to change according to the whims of the regime itself.
Fascinating. Thank you so much. We have one more question from the audience. Dr. Reza Afshari, he has a long comment and with a question in it. I'm going to read the whole thing and then I'll come back and remind you of the question at the end. Thank you for your lecture. Perhaps the Islamic Republic cannot be studied through the lenses established by political scientists approaching other states in the region. Iran is ruled by the faqih, deputy to the hidden imam. How do you remove the faqih or reform his divinely inspired order? I wonder if Dr. Asaadi has read the recent book by Majid Mohammadi. He outlines 4 approaches that could be chosen by the guardian jurist to channel his power and authority vis-a-vis his office. What he calls barracks-oriented approach is most repressive and least open to the public. The leader's office is partly a Politburo, a mafia, and a hayat. Hayat is the site of religious ceremonies and socialization intended to further internalize Islamization. When it comes to business, the leader's office behaves like a mafia. When it comes to public oppression, it behaves like an intelligence unit. When it comes to handling political matters, it acts like a Politburo. The Hayat is the Islamist hub of disinformation. So I'm now, having read it all, wondering if maybe this was a rhetorical question. How do you remove the faqih or reform his divinely inspired order? But if you'd like to comment or answer that comment as a whole, that would be great, Dr. Asaadi.
Yeah, thank you for that question and that information. That's very helpful. So if, part of what I did over a period of 2 years in my book is engage very closely with Iran's constitution. And one thing that's very clear, reading that document as it is there, and to be very clear, I'm not suggesting and I'm not talking about the idea of removing the principle of Velayat al-Faqih. That's constitutive to the Islamic Republic itself. And that's very clear. It's the most repeated phrase throughout the Constitution itself. The idea is to think again about what's the role of the faqih in the broader political system. And so I think if we revisit the Constitution, we'll see, and there was debate among the revolutionaries themselves and from very high-ranking clerics, religious clerics from the ulama, about the different degree of political involvement that this figure should have. So these are really, I think, two separate questions, and I would, draw our attention back to the writing and thinking of someone like Ayatollah Montazeri, who, you can find his treatises about what does Velayat al-Faqih mean and what does it require, what's its history in Shia jurisprudential thought. And I think, that there's a long tradition here from within the culture and from within Shiism that we can see people think differently about the role of political activism for the clergy. So this is really what I'm fascinated in tapping into and bringing back to our attention, the attention, especially of foreign policy communities and so on, to think about what could the Islamic Republic system look like in terms of who is controlling political decisions. So I guess I just wanted to clarify that point. Beyond that, I take the comment very constructively, and we'll look into the source that the commenter mentioned.
Fantastic. I think that about does it for today's event. Thank you all for coming, and thanks especially to Dr. Robert Asaadi for giving us this fascinating presentation on polling and social, gauging social interest in Iran, as well as talking a bit about your book. If y'all are interested, you can find that at Lexington Publishers, Postrevolutionary Iran, The Leader, the People, and the Three Powers. If you're interested in upcoming spotlighting and authors, our next one is with Leora Hindelman Bavour, Creating the Modern Iranian Woman, Popular Culture Between Two Revolutions. That'll be this time on February 24th. If you're interested in learning more about the project, you can check us out at Iran1400.org. We have content in both English and Farsi in the form of articles, videos, podcasts, and events like this that basically are about ideas and institutions in Iran, like modernity, identity, education, fine arts, and the women's movement. If you scroll to the bottom of our website, you can sign up to receive our newsletter that alerts you of all of our upcoming events, as well as when we publish new content. And lastly, you can find us on social media at Iran 1400 Project. If you find today's event interesting, please check out our article, Iran's Modern Judicial System, on our website, and be on the lookout for upcoming articles that we have on Iran's executive and legislative branches. Thanks again for coming, and thanks so much to you, Dr. Asaadi, for a great presentation.